think what we're going to see much more of is Iran playing this out and using those militia in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, as a way to constantly poke the bear, if that's what is required, or poke the conflict, fuel the conflict. And remember, a lot of the arms that Hamas are using have been provided by Iran, and they'll continue to do so.
The front page of the Times focuses on the Red Sea. Britain, the US and 10 other countries have told the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels to stop attacks on shipping in the Red Sea area. Meanwhile, the war in Gaza goes on and threatens to spill over into Lebanon. Iran itself has been rocked by a bomb attack and is threatening revenge. How much can Britain really do about all of this? Well, let's talk now to a man who until very recently was a key player on the world stage and knows more than most about that question. Ben Wallace used to be the Defence Secretary. Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
Now, we have been talking a lot about Iran, its motivations and what's happening in the region on the programme this morning. There is, of course, escalation. How concerned should we be about what we're seeing?
Well, I think the main concern is that obviously these two conflicts, both Gaza and Ukraine, is testing the West's resolve and indeed our alliances, because ultimately in your introduction you talked about how can the rest, or what can the West actually do, or Britain actually do in places like the Red Sea. Our main role, alongside many of our allies, is to come together in alliances to obviously make ourselves bigger collectively. And what we see in the Gulf, for example, is we use one or two of our naval assets to join with the United States and many other countries to make sure that we patrol and protect civilian shipping. But I think the real test in 2024 is going to be these alliances. You know, where does Turkey stand? Where does other nations stand? Hungary, we already see tensions between Hungary, NATO, Hungary, and the EU. And what is their position? Because of course, our adversaries are always trying to punch that stress or wedge us away from our support. And if you see how Iran behaves in Iraq, for example, Iran wants the West out of Iraq. It wants America out of the region. So it will appeal to any opponent to try and put pressure on us or us, the Arab street as well, or also to try and cause friction. So I think that's the main key, is that we're getting into a phase where our alliances are going to be tested and our resolve is going to be tested.
And do you think we will be able to withstand that test?
I think Britain will. I mean, Britain has always been pretty much at the core of these alliances. It's one of the founders of NATO, for example, and indeed it always steps up to the plate when asked or is under test. We have a military designed to be expeditionary. It's obviously not as big as it was during the Cold War, but it is there and able to be around the world in different places, maybe not at scale, but enough to join forces. And that's what we see right now in the Red Sea. But we've got to start asking questions of the government this year about, putting its money where its mouth is.
And I suppose on that question, Ukraine is one of those issues where the government hasn't, although it has said it will spend that money, it hasn't formally recommitted it yet.
Yeah, it hasn't. I asked back in June for the next tranche of money. If you think the financial year ends in April, planners in departments and working with partners such as Ukraine will be already making plans, but without any indication they're going to get any more money, it's very, very hard to continue the leadership that the UK has been taking on Ukraine.
And what do you think's going on there? Why the hesitancy?
I don't know. I'm not in the government anymore, Kate. I don't know. I mean, look, I think, my successor, Grant Shapps, is doing a great job, and he's been pretty clear that he wants to continue this support. He's also been pretty clear. I think he recently said in a select committee he wants 3% of GDP defence spending. I think the question is probably stuck in some of the mechanics that is the Cabinet Office, number 10, and the Treasury, that sort of triumvirate of government structures. But ultimately, we need to start making that indication sometime this month.
I mean, going back to what's happening with Iran in that particular region, how much of that do you think is a reaction to what Israel is doing in Gaza? I know it's a much bigger question, but that and more recently what's happened in Lebanon. I mean, you recently said that Israel's crude and indiscriminate method of attack and a killing rage will fuel decades of conflict in the Middle East. Do you think we're starting to see that now?
Yeah, I mean, I also in an article for one of your rival broadsheets said a few months ago that of course, Iran's fingerprints will be all over a large part of this Gaza conflict. Remember, it is in Iran's interest to appeal to the Arab street. And here's the irony: Hamas is a Sunni organization and Iran is a Shia. And ultimately, Hamas is a great example of Iran's interference and mischief, but also a malign effect in the region. It will pick an ally, any ally, even if religiously they view each other as heretics. I mean, the Sunni extremists would view Shias as heretics, and as a result, what we saw was Iran very quickly appealing to the Arab street in the Gulf, in its rivals in Saudi, Kuwait, etc., to say, we're the only ones who care about the Palestinians. You and your leaders and your monarchs, you don't care. So I think what we're going to see much more of is Iran playing this out and using those militia in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, as a way to constantly poke the bear, if that's what is required, or poke the conflict, fuel the conflict. And remember, a lot of the arms that Hamas are using have been provided by Iran, and they'll continue to do so.
But Ben, Israel has a role in this, doesn't it? I mean, it's very striking that Israel had the capacity to get into to Lebanon and hit a room of 7 Hamas terrorists and kill them in a relatively clean fashion, and yet has also been pursuing what some people regard as indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. Are you concerned at how Israel has pursued its very legitimate war aims against Hamas has caused more problems because it doesn't seem to be conducting that war in an appropriate fashion?
Yeah, I mean, I got quite heavily attacked by a section of the sort of Jewish Chronicle community when I said, look, what we learn about defeating terrorists is you have to keep the terrorist away from its population, its support base. That is the oxygen that terrorists need to survive, need to be able to move around, logistics, need to resupply themselves. If they are wedged apart, 2 things happen. One is you start recruiting informers, and those informers, I suspect, and I have no evidence, but what we saw in that hit in Lebanon was well-informed intelligence led to a clean and clinical hit on the target or the head of Hamas, or one of the heads of Hamas. That's how you start to defeat terrorism. If you take action that is allegedly indiscriminate and starts to drive the population towards people that view as its only hope, you start to build a population base that makes it easier for terrorists to hide in. And my point of the article was, look, Israel have absolutely the right to go after Hamas. Hamas is an absolute terrorist organization. There's no doubt about it. The method, more often than anything else, defines an organization, and that's what's very odd about the BBC's decision not to call them a terrorist. Hamas are terrorists, and Israel has every right to go after them. But I also made the point that Israel have a lot of things on its side. It has time on its side. It has control of the air, land, and sea. It ultimately outnumbers and has a larger military, much more capable military by a country mile, and therefore taking Hamas out should be done in a way that gives us best hope for separating the Palestinian population away from.
And it doesn't look like it is being. I mean, you'll know this better than us. I mean, I have no expertise in this area, but it doesn't look to many, many people around the world that Israel is doing that. Because if it has the capacity to hit people clinically, if it has the military capacity to play the long game, why are bombs falling and falling and falling and falling upon people and civilians dying?
Well, look, first of all, I'm not, on the ground, and I think what I would urge Israel what I would urge Israel to do is to allow access to the media to Gaza, because ultimately we all rely on the mainstream media and the free press to help inform us. And I don't think it helps anyone when there's such restrictions, because we can't take that view, and we end up where we are currently is a sort of slanging match between those who those who try and ask legitimate questions, and those who say, "Oh, you're only asking that because you're anti." I was accused of being anti-Semitic because I just challenged IDF's methods. I didn't challenge Israel's right to defend itself, but somehow I'm labelled as that at the moment. So I think the best thing is let a free press in to look at it. But ultimately, what we have to ask ourselves is, the Prime Minister of Israel presided over probably one of the biggest intelligence failures of Israel's recent history. This dreadful attack of October the 7th, a terrorist attack by an organization who has a genocidal aim for Israel, wants to remove Israel from the map and remove all Jews from the map. Was an appalling act and needed to be responded to. But ultimately, we've got into a situation now where I think you hear it already. You hear the rhetoric coming out of Israel that by some in the community that they are going to wipe them out. They're going to annihilate Hamas. Well, if you go back to 2002 and earlier, you'll hear the then Prime Minister of Israel, Sharon, talk about the same language and their efforts to go after Hamas and indeed at that time part of the PLA. That was in 2002, 22 years ago now, that same language. And it didn't, I'm afraid, have the success they wanted. Because ultimately terrorism needs to be starved of the oxygen of passive public support, not just active public support. In Northern Ireland, we saw in early 1970s, we saw the mass nationalist population be turned towards passive support for the IRA, not active, but passive support, turn a blind eye after what they felt was an overreaching military UK response, Bloody Sunday followed by internment. And we just have to starve them. Now, to be fair, there will be people in Israel who say, look, the whole of Gaza is full of terrorists. Everybody, there's no saving that population. They all believe that we should be annihilated. And if that's their view, they're going to not have any sympathy with my observation. But all the polls show that the majority of the Palestinian people still do not support Hamas. They do also show, however, that support for Hamas has grown amongst the Palestinian people.
So does that mean, in your view, it's time for a ceasefire in that particular conflict?
No, I haven't argued for a ceasefire. I think my point was that when I wrote the article, my point was quite clear that what we need is Israel to do some things differently. It's up to the IDF ultimately, but I wanted the Israeli Defense Force to do some things differently, recognizing they have time on their hand, they have control of air, sea, and land. And as we've just seen yesterday or the day before in Lebanon, they can do things differently. And historically, they used to do things differently. You get informers in an organization when a population turns against the terrorist. In the 1990s, when the IRA had to come to the table with its first ceasefire in 1994, by that stage, the IRA had been entirely penetrated by informers. And at the same time, they weren't just informers. I remember being there when ordinary members of the nationalist community would just pick up the confidential phone and anonymously leave information because they didn't want these men of violence amongst themselves.
Just very briefly, because we've run out of time already, I just have to ask you, the Met Police is investigating war crimes in Gaza. Boris Johnson has said that is worrying. It's a politicisation of the Met Police. What's your view on that?
Our policing in this country is independent. It's not for politicians to interfere with their choices. But I do think it's important, whatever choices, and we've seen over the last few years criticism of policing priorities. And I think ultimately we have to ask ourselves how much resource a police force has and therefore what are its priorities. Now, look, we are obligated under international treaty to help the International Criminal Court, whoever they are investigating. And let's remember, the ICC is also investigating one of the biggest criminals at large at the moment, President Putin, and what he is doing in Ukraine. And, I'm glad we have a unit that investigates war crimes and helps support the ICC, because ultimately that unit will be involved probably in also collecting evidence against President Putin for what he's done. So, but the individual choices, that is a matter for the Commissioner of the Met Police. It's not a matter for me as a Member of Parliament to interfere.
Ben Wallace, Conservative MP, former Defence Secretary, thank you for your time.
Interesting stuff. The IDF needs to do things differently. And what happened in Lebanon is an example of how to go after a terrorist organisation rather than more widespread bombing.
And that Ben Wallace has been accused of being an anti-Semite for for talking about, some of the tactics involved here, but for not questioning Israel's right to defend itself. I think, that it's a really interesting area.
It's ridiculous if claims like that are thrown around to stop people having a debate about how wars can be conducted, because you have to be allowed to have that sort of debate. Otherwise, what sort of society have we become?